Welcome to Trifecta Collective, Finding the Root with Megan and Shannon, the podcast where we dive deep into all things health and wellness to help you find health and healing inside and out for now and forever. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Trifecta Collective, Finding the Root with Megan and Shannon. I am one of your hosts, Megan Abbott here, owner and founder of Trifecta Collective, our holistic health practice. And this is my co-host, Shannon Callery, our head practitioner of Trifecta Collective. And we're so excited to be back here. And today is our first real deep dive into a very specific topic. And this is a big one for us. We have a lot of things to say about this, one as practitioners, but also from personal experience and dealing with this for a long time, and working with a lot of clients who come to us with this chronic issue and us being able to help them finally resolve this. So today our big topic is small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, aka SIBO. So kind of our outline here of what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about what is SIBO, how do you test for it. We'll talk about the standard testing methods here at the beginning. We'll talk about the different types of SIBO. We'll talk about how it's usually addressed in Western medicine and also functional medicine. Why these things often don't work long-term and why people end up with chronic SIBO, including both Shannon and myself. And then we'll get into how we address SIBO and looking at the bigger picture of SIBO. Why do we get SIBO? What are the bigger root causes? How do we look and test for SIBO? And then most importantly, how do we address SIBO and how do we keep it away so that it's not a current and chronic issue that you have to suffer and deal with? So let's get started with what is SIBO. So Shannon, I will pass it to you if you want to explain what SIBO is.
So pretty much there's two different types of SIBO. So there's the methane SIBO, and forgive me because we don't use these terms. One is constipation, one is diarrhea, essentially. Both involve a lot of discomfort and gas in the stomach, and it's pretty much a bacterial overgrowth that's in your small intestines. There's so much to this. The main form of testing is the breath test that you can actually go into your your medical doctor and have them do. I did this test. Did you do the breath test?
So many times.
Yeah.
I did so many of these tests.
Yeah. I did the breath test. I don't remember doing, I had functional lab testing around it, which showed SIBO. I did the breath test. I'm pretty sure I failed the breath test, but it was very apparent that SIBO was a thing. But yeah, the main description of it is a bacterial infection in your intestines. And I don't know if you want to add on to that at all.
Yeah. So, and really what happens here, because this is really important to understand when we get into bigger root causes is, so it's your large intestine has all of this different kind of bacteria, which is 100% supposed to be there. However, when certain things we'll say go wrong and checks and balances aren't there, that bacteria or certain kinds of bacteria from your large intestine can overgrow into your small intestine, which they're not supposed to be there. And this can cause a whole wide range of symptoms. Shannon touched on a bunch: constipation, diarrhea, gas. Really, for me, really, really bad smelling gas for many people. Room clearing, terrible gas. It can cause a lot of pressure under your abdomen, and it can almost feel like it can be hard to breathe because you can get so bloated under your rib cage that I remember it would be hard for me to breathe after I would eat sometimes. And it wasn't because I was overly full or anything. It was just I'd get that significant bloating right under my rib cage, and that's super uncomfortable. Some people experience acid reflux with this too. A lot of food sensitivities can definitely happen as well. And technically speaking, there's 3 kinds of SIBO. And this is near and dear to my heart because I had the third kind that no one talks about. So there's the hydrogen, methane, and then a sulfate based one. And there's technically no test unless you know how to read a breath test appropriately for the third one. So it cannot show up on a breath test because the breath test is designed for the hydrogen and methane and to look at those, but not the third one, once again, unless you know how to read it, because it does show up, but it's not a direct test. You can also, this will show up in a variety of stool testing with bacterial overgrowths, but I'll also say, I mean, I had 5 stool tests done. And even like the last one that I did, they were like, oh, you're great. Your gut is amazing. Like all the bacterial issues are gone. And I go, cool, but I still have all of the same symptoms that I'm experiencing. So there's something still wrong. So yeah, that just a couple other things to note here with that. So those are the main ways to test. Some Western medicine physicians will test via the breath test. Some will not, but that is kind of the gold standard. Functional medicine, usually a stool test and or a breath test. So yeah, and then if we look at how does actually, before I move on to like, how do we address this? Anything else I'm missing here?
No, I was just going to kind of tag on and say like same thing with I cannot tell you how many stool tests I've had. And I'm so sorry if you can hear loud lawn care right now because it's going on right below me. So apologize for that. Yeah, no, nothing super additional to that. Just kind of same thing. Like I also had all the testing done, all the GI map testing, or the stool testing, and always came back with the same response of, yeah, no, like you're good. We don't see it here, even though I had all the symptoms. So that's kind of why we don't focus on all of that testing. And we'll talk about the testing that we do like, but yeah.
Yeah. So if we look at how do most people address, and really there's 2 ways. One is a prescription medication, and this is usually prescribed for anywhere between 7 to 14 days, depending on your prescribing physician. There's a handful, usually the first line of defense, and this does widely depend on the physician, but I'd say the most common medication is rifloximine, is the most common kind of antibiotic that's often used. It works for some people. It doesn't work for others. But we'll talk about long-term why this often doesn't work. And then looking at supplements, usually there's kind of 2 main protocols I feel like are widely used in the holistic functional medicine route. Usually there's the Candibactin route, Candibactin AR and BR. Usually the recommendation is 4 to 6 weeks for that. And then for biotics, also has a protocol itself. Usually it's at least the FC-Cytal and Dysbiocide, also for 4 to 6 weeks. Sometimes there's a third product in for the biotics one. You can also kind of make your own. I've also been put on this, like make your own that has like some sort of oil of oregano and like maybe some other kind of herbs in there that are antimicrobials, and some sort of like, I think one of the big ones that I was on, and I think I was on this a few times, was oil of oregano and biocidin for breaking down the
Biofilm.
Yes, breaking down those biofilms. And sometimes I got relief, sometimes I didn't, but it always came back. And then
I can't tell you how many times I've been on all those supplements.
So
Unfortunately.
many. Yeah. And then the other piece of this, which we have very strong feelings on, is the low FODMAP diet, which is the most common elimination diet that's often used with this.
Oh yeah. And we run into so many people, so many people come to us who are on this diet. And I know so many people personally, like in life, that I run into, family members, friends, who come to me and they're like, yeah, they gave me this diet and they told me to stay on it forever. And that's like heartbreaking to me, because if you have ever seen the low FODMAP diet, you know how crazy restrictive it is. And it is not any way that you could live like a normal life around food. This topic, is like so upsetting to me. So we do not recommend that crazy strict of a diet to help heal this. And granted, I know that there are some people that it has worked for, just like everything in life. Like there's many things that work for some people that don't work for others. It's very bio-individual, but in large, our approach, which does not involve this diet, we see really great results.
And the low FODMAP diet really, and certainly like, we're not going to do like a full deep dive and like, what can you eat and what can't you eat? There's easy information available online about that. But generally speaking, you're avoiding a lot of sugars. And the reason being is sugars will feed the bacteria, and then you will have excess symptoms that result as a part of that. And there's even some like non-sugary type things. I mean, there's a lot of fruits that are cut out, some vegetables that are cut out. And even like for me, garlic and onions, I mean, that was really tough for me to cut out. And those were two things that I really reacted to. And I cut those out for years because I was still reacting to these. And when a lot of people recommend this, they'll recommend it for 30, 60, 90 days. If you meet with someone in the holistic health world, that's usually the recommendation here. And then there's a reintroductory period. Big question mark on whether you're going to be able to reintroduce those things. And here's the thing, for some people, what'll happen is you go on the low FODMAP diet for 30, 60, 90 days. You also do this SIBO protocol, one of these SIBO protocols, and then you reintroduce the foods. And for many people at that time, they can reintroduce those foods until they start reacting to them again, which is where the big issues come in. And some people never react again. Some people are totally fine. And we're not saying that this is totally wrong. We're just saying that for so many, they deal with chronic SIBO issues because there's other things that are missed here. The other thing I'll say is, and this is just from personal experience, from experiencing this and also hearing this from clients all the time, if you have IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, usually the general recommendation is to go on a low FODMAP diet. And that's it. And that's just your forever diet. And once again, like, it's really restrictive. It's really hard to live a life this way. And you're never, almost never going to be able to heal just doing this kind of elimination diet. And I know Shannon will have something to say about this, but not only is this just really restrictive in your life in general, but you can also go down a pretty dark road here, mentally and emotionally, restricting these kinds of ways and these really strict elimination diets for long term, because it can lead to some things some dark things.
Oh yeah. Yep. Really dark things. I mean, that was the starting point, I would say, of my eating disorder, which, at the time I didn't realize was an eating disorder. No one really does. I had been handed the low FODMAP diet, like, if I remember correctly, at least 5 times from dietitians that they sent me to for, irritable bowel syndrome. Even at like a holistic MD, just like so many times. And it just spun from there. Like when that didn't work, well, let's try this one. Let's try the low histamine diet, and let's just try cutting out like all the refined sugar. And granted, like some of these things like gluten and dairy, I still don't eat gluten because that's just not something that agrees with my body. And then same with dairy, I can do like sheep and goat's milk, but I can't do cow's milk. Still hoping I can add that back in at some point, but pretty much like it just spirals from that point. And again, like having no guidance with these, like when someone's handing you, I'm just like envisioning myself sitting in the doctor's office being handed this piece of paper and they're like, here you go, follow this. And you're looking at it and you're like, what am I going to eat? Like how in the stress starts to build in your body, which we'll get to this in a second here, but it's like root cause and whatnot. Stress has a huge piece to do with this. And just like, yeah, it's not a sustainable thing by any means.
Yeah. And I had a history of eating disorders, and I had a history of disordered eating. Before my car accident, I was getting ready for a bodybuilding competition and doing it the wrong way, as most people do in that space, and was really restrictive in my eating. And then I started on all of these elimination diets, and not only do you develop disordered eating, but you can also really develop, and for me, like a significant fear of food. And you're just like, for me, there was a period of time, and my poor husband now, I'm so thankful he stayed with me during all of this, because looking back now, I'm like, gosh, I was a hermit. I mean, I'm an introvert, and I'm usually a pretty hermity type person. But during these periods of times when I was on this and really going through all kinds of health issues, I mean, I would really hermit, because I was so not, I was just afraid to eat in general, let alone if I had to go out and try and eat something. I mean, just I would almost put myself in like almost a full-blown panic attack, because I'm like,
For
all right,
sure.
well, what if, like, for me, it was twofold. It was one, my back issues. I was like, am I going to be able to sit somewhere? What are these seats going to look like? Can I stand up if I need to? Am I going to have to stand the whole time? Because I can't stand for more than like 10 or 15 minutes during periods of when I was like really going through a lot of chronic pain. And then it was like, all right, well, am I gonna have a lot of bloating? Like, am I gonna like start to have like really bad gas? Am I gonna have to run to the bathroom? Like, is there gonna be anything on my list of foods that I can eat? What does it even look like? And it very, very, very overwhelming. And certainly we know so many clients come to us and are in a very, very similar position.
Oh yeah, and I almost feel like I almost feel like that in itself needs to be like a trigger warning for people. I'm having like flashbacks of me in high school, like panicking because I had the worst like gas and bloating and stomach symptoms that I mean, I missed a lot of high school because I would either skip it or find some way to get out of it. And it was because my body was so uncomfortable. And it was also just so embarrassing. Going back to what you said about like the gas and stuff, like it smells like sewer.
Yeah.
And it was so awful and such an embarrassing thing to go to or just have to deal with like when you're that young too. All of it. It's so much.
Yeah, yeah. And it's, when you do this short term and you can reintroduce the foods, it's not, I mean, it's still a lot. It's still very stressful. But when I mean, Shannon and I were on elimination diets for years and years and years, and you're just building upon all of these things, all of the anxiety, all of the stress. And, for me too, like the other piece of this was like, what do I even wear? I'm like, so I can wear like something like form fitting as a starting point because I look fine. But then what happens if I eat something and it doesn't agree with me, and then all of a sudden I look pregnant, and so I ended up with like wearing a lot of baggy clothes because I was just like, I don't want to look pregnant. I don't want anyone to say anything. Like, how embarrassing would it be for me to like go out and then be like, oh, like what are you expecting? I'm like, I'm not. I just have all of my gut issues going on, and so that just adds like a whole other layer to all of this.
Yeah, the toll that it takes on your mental health. I mean, and I'm still like there's still parts of this that I'm healing from like mentally. I remember I still have the tact of overpacking when I go on any trip because you never know what you're going to feel like that day. Like you said, like what is my belly going to be like when I eat this random food? Or I could wake up in the morning and just like be a completely different person and feel awful. So there's so many things that go with it, especially along the side of like mental health. And that is a large part of, in my opinion, root cause of the whole SIBO thing to start with in itself. And it just gets so much worse throughout it when you let it go that far.
Yeah, for sure. And before we dive into the root cause piece, I also just want to acknowledge this piece as well. I know I experienced it. I know most, especially women, experience a lot of this. Is you end up with all of these chronic symptoms and issues, and you do have a lot of fears and anxieties that come up. And then the recommendation is, oh, let's put you on an anti-anxiety medication, because the anxiety and a lot of times the depression and the fears, like these are all coming up. And when you explain it to someone who's never experienced all of this, yeah, they're gonna be like, of course you have anxiety. Like, here's a medication. This is why you're having all of these things, but not understanding that all of these emotions and all of these stressors that are coming up and all of these protocols and all of these things that you have to think about, it's so overwhelming, and it's something you're struggling with all of the time. And it's often something you don't want to share across the board with everyone in your life. And if you do, you know what, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But then you end up just shutting down because everyone's like, well, what can you eat? Where can you go? Like, how are you feeling today? Like, oh, so and so high maintenance because she can only eat da 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 da. And of
The high
course,
maintenance term gets me every time.
yeah, yeah. So you end up having some anxiety issues. And yes, medication can be helpful in this, but also at the same time, of course you have anxiety. Dealing with all of these things coming up, of course you're going to end up with some mental health struggles because it's so overwhelming to deal with this.
Yeah. Yeah. It is, and if you're ready to dive into the root cause part right now, stress is definitely one of those things, along with so many other things. Like low stomach acid is a big thing. And again, another very controversial topic, the stomach acid. I know that a lot of what we hear is, when we have acid reflux, like you have too much stomach acid. So then we add in like the over the counter medications or, PPIs, whatever it may be. That's like a huge thing. And this can actually be the start of how some of this bacteria can grow in your gut, because our stomach acid is like the first line of defense for our body when we're eating. We need an acidic stomach to actually break down our food in the pathogens and anything that could potentially be on the food. So this is like a huge piece to this. And that's another thing that I feel like society is slowly coming around to realizing, that maybe all the medication in lowering our stomach acid is not the answer here.
Yeah, and I want to backstep here just a little for two things. So one, so often these protocols, these standard protocols, whether you go medication route, whether you go supplement route, often don't work, or just the low FODMAP diet. These things often don't work, and this is why we hear so often recurrent SIBO, or SIBO is so hard to get rid of because it's chronic and it comes back again and again. And Shannon and I both experienced this, and it's because you didn't address the bigger things and the whys. So now we're going to get into the whys. And I also, I just want to talk about stress here for a minute. And I know we'll go even deeper into this in some of the other episodes, but I just want to talk about stress real quick and why chronic stress is such a big root cause here, because it's so downstream. So I want to talk about two big things that chronic stress naturally does. So the first thing that chronic stress does, and if we're eating in a chronically stressed state, our stomach acid production is naturally lower. So if you were eating on the run, if you're not chewing your food, if you're just like in a hyper-responsive, like sympathetic stress state, your stomach acid is naturally just going to be lower, whether or not you normally have stomach acid issues or not. It's naturally going to drop. And the reason being is, if we think like way back in the day, if we were being chased by a predator, let's say we were being chased by a tiger, it probably wouldn't be super beneficial for us to stop and have a snack and like digest that snack while we were being chased by this animal predator. So if we're chronically stressed, our body doesn't know the difference between a tiger and another form of chronic stress that we experience nowadays. And so our digestion is just naturally going to start to shut down a little bit, and it's not going to work optimally. So we need to be in a little bit more of a parasympathetic, relaxed, a little bit more like rest and digest kind of state when we're going to eat. And we'll certainly dive deeper into that. But that's like the first thing that can happen. Another thing that can happen is when we're in a chronic state of stress, and we will do, I promise, at least one other episode on this, our cortisol production, which is one of our stress hormones, naturally increases, which should happen. Like that is what our body should do. However, what our body is designed to do is be able to handle these short periods of stress and then come back down. The issue comes in when we're chronically stressed and we don't have that come back down kind of thing. And what happens during that is cortisol is produced by our adrenal glands. And when it's produced, and especially chronically produced, it needs a lot of nutrients to be able to work, especially like sodium, potassium, magnesium, vitamin C, zinc oftentimes. And so when we're chronically stressed and we have chronic cortisol issues and adrenal issues, it's also pulling and stealing a lot of nutrients. And there's also a lot of those same nutrients are required to make stomach acid. And so it's almost like a twofold in that one, our body, if we're eating chronically stressed, we're not producing enough naturally. But two, even if we weren't, if we're still chronically stressed and our adrenals are having a really tough time, do we have enough nutrients to produce the stomach acid that's even required? And then, it's kind of like, then we got a snowball effect, and then we have gut issues, and then we're not absorbing nutrients, and then really now we don't have enough nutrients to produce stomach acid, among many other things, and it just kind of snowballs there. But I think that's a really important thing to note. In this is one of the reasons why chronic stress is such a big issue and needs to be addressed with chronic SIBO issues.
Yeah, definitely. And I love that saying digestion begins in the brain, because, that's essentially what you just explained, is it does begin in the brain. And that is such a huge piece to this. And that's, again, why it's not just one thing that is going to help heal this. It's like a multi approach. There's a couple different things that we have to do, which, again, reiterating on what you said, which is, it's why it's a reoccurring thing for a lot of people, is because we're not taking this like multi-dimensional approach to healing it.
Yeah, for sure. So low stomach acid is for sure a really big one. And if you're not, if you're like, I don't know, do I have low stomach acid or not? There's a really easy baking soda test that you can take. Now, look, it's not perfect. It's not like this is the test, this is the be all and all. No, this is a tool to use, but you drink a little bit of baking soda first thing in the morning on empty, mixed in some water, and you see how long it takes you to burp. And if you burp within, like, if you don't burp within like the first 3 to 4 minutes, like a real, like a big burp, chances are you have some low stomach acid. And we can also look at, like your CO2 and chloride markers in blood work, which is part of a complete metabolic panel, which is a standard panel that almost every primary care physician runs as part of their yearly, just yearly protocol or yearly testing. This is something that they usually run. And if we look at those markers, that'll also give us some insight along with symptoms. I mean, we can tell just by talking to someone usually and getting their list of symptoms. Do they likely have some stomach acid production issues?
Yeah. Maybe we should link the book below if people are interested in learning a little bit more about that. It's called Why Stomach Acid is Good for You. I do not remember the author, but we'll link that below in case you guys are interested in kind of learning a little bit more on your own.
Yeah, and we'll put the baking soda test on there too, just so you have access to that. I think it's a 1/4 teaspoon, if I remember off the top of my head, mixed in like 4 to 6 ounces of water. But we'll definitely put that in the show notes here so that you guys can see. So yeah, low stomach acid is a really big one. Stress and stressed eating is a really big one. And we'll also tie this into, we'll use this phrase a lot, and we'll do other episodes that take like really deep dives into this, but nervous system dysregulation, AKA your body's stuck in a chronic state of stress or a chronic state of fight or flight. If you are in that state, your digestion is going to take a really big toll. And on the other side, if you have nervous system dysregulation issues, the chances of you being able to heal and stay healed long-term with your gut issues is slim to none.
I have a good story for this. So,
Yeah.
And I will never forget this. I had just left like my, seeing like my 5th doctor or something, trying to figure out like my SIBO issues. At the time, that's what they were calling it before it progressed. And I was in a craft store with my mom standing in line. And this was like, I don't know, maybe 2012. Like SIBO was not a big thing, not as big as it is now. And we had just left the doctors. We were like, let's go to the store, like try and find something. I had something internally was telling me all along, like, this is because of your stress. Like, you need to manage your stress. This won't go away until you can manage your stress. I had that little voice in my head, but I didn't know well enough to listen to it. So we hear this lady talking to her friends across the store saying, yeah, I got diagnosed with SIBO, but I knew it was my stress. And I started doing like all these crafts, and then everything went away. Like, I started focusing on myself and my hobbies again. And my stomach issues went away. And I remember like my mom turning her head and looking at me, and she's like, I cannot believe that lady just said that. It was like a sign from the divine being like, hey, pay attention to me. Like, stress is a big thing that you're not focusing on. I still ignored it because I wasn't very in touch with myself back then, but I had to share that because that was such a pivotal point for me where I really started to think about stress being a root cause.
Yeah. And my gut was in a pretty good place before I started doing like my deeper dive into nervous system regulation. But, and my gut issues like towards the end would trigger like back pain flares as well. Like if my motility was really slow again, if I was like really stressed and not sleeping, I would end up having like the left side of my back would start to hurt. And I'd start to have pain again. And yeah, I mean, that when I really started doing the nervous system, I was like, oh, I like really never have any like food sensitivity. I mean, I don't eat gluten. I also don't do dairy, cow's dairy. But like really like my gut issues, like these are really like not becoming an issue anymore. Like the constipation issues that I dealt with for a long time, that just like wasn't an issue anymore. And I was like, oh, I'm not even doing anything right now for my physical body. Now I had done a whole bunch of stuff. And I think that this is a piece for many people. I don't think this alone can change it for a lot of people who have been suffering for many, many, many years. But yeah, I was like, oh, like that I just don't have these issues anymore. Like this is crazy to me. That this mental and emotional body played such a big role.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and just, nutrient deficiencies we've talked about. Let's get into the diet piece here, because there's a lot of nuances to this. Now, certainly, we're not big fans of low FODMAP. We're actually, as a practice, we don't promote strict elimination diets by and large. We will do modified elimination diets temporarily sometimes, if needed, for symptom management while we're doing bigger, other deeper work. And that's the way we utilize elimination diets. Now, this isn't to say we don't talk about nutrition, because we absolutely do. And there are some things that we can focus on that really help our body from a nutritional standpoint. And we'll dive into like some of the ways that we look at this. But I just want to throw that out there that yes, nutrition plays a role. We're not saying nutrition doesn't play a role, but we're personally not big fans of these strict elimination diets because we know all the other things that we've already talked about that come into play when it comes to these elimination diets.
Yeah. And, if we're getting into food a little bit, the main thing that you can do for yourself and I will say like I feel like most of our clientele is females. So I feel comfortable when I say this, that most females do not eat enough food, specifically protein. So that is a big thing that we focus on, is getting people to pay attention to adding more protein into their diet, noticing how they feel when they add it in. And it's a um, pretty easy thing to recognize that how much better they feel when they start to be more protein focused on their food. And again, we're not telling you, don't eat carbs, don't eat fats, don't eat fruit. All of that stuff is fair game. We just really focus on the amount of protein that we're getting in our body per day.
Yeah, and this is really important. And this is even for me, like with my personal training, this is something that, I really started to realize very early with clients is just the lack of protein in your diet. And this is really important. One, protein is very nutrient dense. There's a lot of nutrients in there. It's also only one of two essential nutrients that our body requires to live, fats being the other one. Now, this Once again, this isn't to say carbohydrates aren't good, aren't beneficial, because absolutely they are, especially for women, especially for menstruating women. But technically speaking, we don't need them to live. Protein is also helps to stimulate stomach acid production. And this is really crucial. And this is another huge reason, especially for people with gut issues, why we focus on this protein. It's like, all right, make sure we're getting a source of protein at every meal and start your meal with that source of protein, because we know that's what's going to trigger your stomach acid production, which is going to help with everything when it comes to digestion. And that's such a big piece here. And not to mention, like, protein's really good for, bone density, muscle mass, like so many other things. And I'll say, like, second, let's focus on vegetable intake, like protein, veggies, and then anything else. And here's the thing, like, if we're eating animal protein, we're probably getting fats in there. So we're not as concerned with the fat intake, although certainly we highly recommend getting good quality fats. And then the vegetable intake. And if you eat protein and then veggies and then anything else, here's the other thing that happens. You're naturally not going to be as hungry for those other things. And those other things, not saying they're bad, but oftentimes they aren't as quality or nutrient dense as some of the other things. And so this is one of the strategies that we utilize in our practice a lot, because it's also not restrictive.
Yeah. And we very much believe in the emotional side of things too. Like, we understand that there is benefit to eating, like those certain like comfort foods and whatnot. That's why we don't go into, oh, like you need to give this up and whatnot, because again, not very realistic, and they do serve a purpose at times. But yeah, we really see great results in helping others with just focusing on these two things. And then I like to wait until a little bit down the line to talk about more like, the quality of the food, and kind of diving deeper into, what's like really, really great for your body and what's maybe not the best option. But again, we tend to do that like later down the line when they are done focusing on root issues and kind of have the mental space to focus on that.
Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, that's looking at nutrition here. That also helps with some of the nutrient deficiencies and the stomach acid and reducing stress, like internal stress inside the body. And then let's get into the two big ones here. So the first one is, we'll start with toxins. So, because this feeds into the second one, literally. So toxin overload. So toxin overload, and this could be heavy metals, which, by the way, we're all exposed to, particularly aluminum. It's in everything. If you're not careful, this could be things like just environmental toxins, especially if you live in like a big city. I mean, we almost always see toxin overload issues, like if people are living in bigger cities where the pollution is just naturally higher. And then mold. And we're not going to go deep into mold today, because this is going to be at least a handful of other podcasts, because we have a lot to say about mold, but mold being another really big one. And the reason why these are so big and so important is because they feed and fuel gut overgrowths. This is bacteria, yeast, fungus, and parasites. And if you don't address this, guess what? Everything is going to keep being fed by these toxins, and you're just going to end up with these gut overgrowths again and again and again and again.
Yep. And it's so, and even the way that we, excuse me, even the way that we address this is we kind of do it in that order. Like, we're going to focus on if there's heavy metals or mold, whatever is a thing, we're going to focus on removing that first, maybe doing a little bit of killing for bacteria, parasites, whatnot, along with it. And typically what we do, especially with mold, is try and do a little bit more killing at the end of getting the toxins out, because they feed on those things, and we want to make sure we're getting everything out. So that's kind of like the last piece before we wrap it up and go into like the rebuilding portion.
Yeah. And when we look at toxins, this is going to be with parasites is going to be the next one, the last one we talk about here. Spoiler alert. But, and toxins, when we look at why, like, how does someone get this? Like, how does it show up on testing? This is going to be a little bit more complicated, and maybe we'll do another episode on like deeper dive into blood work and how we interpret blood work. But blood work, it will show up on blood work. And we look at like liver and kidney markers are give us some insight into this. Cholesterol and lipids, that's definitely a great other episode to talk about. It'll often show up there. We can look at blood sugar regulation. It can show up there. Certainly inflammation markers, it can show up there. So it's just like a few of the ways. And if we look at, do we want to do additional testing? An HTMA is typically like the gold standard. A hair tissue mineral analysis is the gold standard for heavy metals, although interpretation does need to be appropriate. And just because you have low heavy metals on an HTMA test doesn't mean you don't have toxin issues. It could be that you're just not excreting them. So there's a fine line in how to interpret that. For mold, we look at an organic acids test. That is our preferred method. Secondary would be a mycotoxin test. And then environmental toxins, we can look at a total tox test. And those are kind of like the three big tests that we can use secondary if we need it, if we decide that's important testing to be done, and that varies person to person when it comes to like just outside of the blood work. But we always start with blood work because we do get a lot of insight into toxin levels inside the body just via blood work.
Yeah, blood work, and then, just talking to someone too, to hearing their symptoms, what they're dealing with. And, I know tests don't guess, which is why we choose blood work for the number one thing. But a lot of times when we get into, and this is coming from two people who spent a ton of money on testing, sometimes when we go right for the testing and then we get it back and we don't see a ton, like you could have just wasted like $400 or $500 on something that you didn't need. So it's so much easier to start with blood work because we can pull so much out of blood work combined with the symptoms that you're having. It's just a really great place to start.
Yeah, for sure. And then, so next would be parasites. And if you've got some toxin overload issues, there's also a really good chance you've got some parasite issues. And parasites and SIBO go really, really hand in hand. And look, like some people do stool testing for parasites, which, I mean, once again, I'll tell you, like I did five stool tests and parasites did not come up one time. And parasites were a massive issue for me. Not to be super gross, but I mean, the amount of things I saw come out of me, and that is not the case for everyone, by the way. I mean, really intense. When I started doing parasite work the right way, and once again, we'll do another episode specifically on parasites. But parasites can be really difficult to test for directly. Now, the way we look at parasites is if we look at the CBC with differential, a complete blood count with differential, which once again, this is a super common test that most physicians run as part of like yearly blood work. We look at the relationship between the monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. And if we look at all three of those together and we're seeing elevations or trends in those being on the higher end of our functional ranges, that's often a really good indication of parasites, along with, once again, we also look at symptoms. If you've got bloating in that lower part of your belly, that is a huge indication of parasites. Not saying, and usually what will happen is if you've got SIBO and parasites, you'll have that pregnant belly, that real like hard, pregnant looking belly kind of bloat.
Yeah. And some people, I actually dealt with this, actually have like the spots that will show up. They kind of look like ringworm spots. There's a couple different things. I would say the lower belly bloat is the biggest that we see. And then also most people don't pay attention to this, but if you're really into like, energy, full moon stuff, if your symptoms get worse around the full moon, that's another really good indication that parasites might be an issue for you because they become more active around the full moon.
Yeah, exactly. And we can do additional parasite. We don't only do parasite work around the full moon, but you can do additional protocols, and we'll talk about maintenance here in a few minutes, and we'll talk about full moon protocols here. So yeah, those are the big root causes. And here's the thing, in our practice, we look at all of these because It's usually not one. It's usually a few of these that all go hand in hand because they really do, especially like chronic stress slash nervous system dysregulation, low stomach acid, toxin overload, and parasites. These go hand in hand so much. So when we go to address these, which we're going to talk about the steps that we use to address these, it's so important that we look at all of these, but there's also an order of operations to make sure that you don't feel worse, a lot worse. No promises. Yes, you can have some detox reactions, but we try to mitigate these as much as possible. And doing these things in a very specific way can help with that. But yeah, we have to look at all of these things together because it's I don't know if I can name a case in the last handful of years that it's only been one thing that someone struggled with. It's multiple.
Yeah. And that's just kind of they go together. And I know that again that's kind of another controversial thing, especially with parasites, but it's like when you've worked with people for so long and that's constantly what you see, it's like, I don't know what else to say. Like, this is all that I see with everyone. And this is it's how it is. That's why we address multiple things at one time.
Yeah. So how we address this in our practice is one, we look at some actual testing and we talk to someone. What are someone's big root causes? Do we need to do additional testing? Do we feel comfortable just based on symptoms, based on blood work? Do we feel comfortable with what we're identifying as someone's big root causes? Then we start with liver detox pathway support work. And we do a couple of these things as a starting point. You know, we're looking at nutrition as a starting point, and we're adding that protein in. We're looking at nervous system regulation and stress management. Can we add in something small for that? Usually we'll start with like a 5 to 10 minute daily practice of some sort with these things. You know, we're looking at lifestyle. Can we be more relaxed when we eat? Can we chew our food when we eat? You know, can we stimulate that stomach acid production more naturally? And then supplements. And we don't like to use a lot. We like to use a few. I tell people 3 to 6 supplements is kind of our goal to really fall into that range. More is not always better. And when you do this more targeted approach, you end up not having to spend as much and you're actually addressing these bigger root causes here when it comes to supplementation. So liver detox pathway support work is where we start. And a couple reasons why. One, toxin overload. If we've got toxin overload issues, we have to start very slow in the binding process to get these things out. Same thing with killing. If we have any killing to do, which if we have SIBO, we've got some killing to do, let alone if there's parasites or candida or anything else going on. Before you kill anything, you need to make sure these pathways to get these things out of the body is open and clear. And if you don't, the chances of you having these detox reactions, these Herx reactions that we've talked about, goes up significantly. So this is almost like a preparation phase to really make the rest of the process a little bit easier. So the likelihood of you getting really sick at any point in time goes down drastically. And it also, I mean, this is liver detox pathway support is a foundational piece. And once again, we'll talk more about this when we talk about chronic stress and that kind of stuff too.
Yeah. And this topic is also very near to my heart because that is one of the things that I had to learn on my own. Unfortunately, no one explained that to me, and it put me in a really bad position multiple times. Yeah. No one talked to me about supporting my liver or my other drainage pathways. We always went in, started hard with the killing, and it always ended bad every single time. So this piece is so important, and that's why we start there with everyone.
Yeah. And if you have sensitivity to supplements, this is why. You do not have open and well supported drainage or liver detox pathways, and you have it is way more important. This is important for everyone across the board, but if you have these sensitivities to supplements, it's even more important. And we often have to go a little bit slower in the process here because we have to make sure these pathways are super open and you're having anywhere between ideally 2 to 4 full complete bowel movements every single day before we go into other bigger work.
Yeah, definitely. And I was that person. I could barely take like one capsule of anything without turning into a complete mess, having crazy headaches, rashes, constipation, all the things. So I know firsthand exactly what that's like.
Yeah, yeah. So once we do that, then we can go into like toxins using different binders. And the binders, binders, there's a lot of them out there. Charcoal and clay are probably the two most common ones. I'll say by and large, we do not use these in our practice when we don't have to. And the reason being is they are non-selective binders, meaning they bind up anything and everything. You need to take them away from food and supplements and medications because they bind up literally everything. And a lot of the binders that we use is from a company called Cellcore. I haven't found any other binders on the market, and trust me, I keep an eye out. These are selective binders, meaning they only bind to specific and certain things in the body, and they have different ones that are targeted for different things as well. And they also have like, a little bit less strong, and then they move up in their strength and intensity as the body becomes more open and ready to do some of the bigger and stronger work. Now, this is also not just a plug for Cellcore. We don't only use their products. These are practitioner only supplements. You can't just go out and get these products. Just keep in mind with that for a reason. They are very strong, but they're also extremely effective in their use. But we use them as a tool for people.
Yeah, and we do use we use one other binder, the GI detox, kind of in the later phases if needed. But again, that is a selective binder, and you do have to take that one on an empty stomach, which, can sometimes cause more stress for people, which is why we tend to use the Cellcore ones first, and they're mighty strong.
Yes. Yeah. So then we're binding up toxins. And then kind of along the same time, we can start digging into like the yeast, fungus, bacteria, and parasites. And then really like the goal is like once that's cleared out, and that time frame is different for every person. And we'll talk more about that in other episodes as we dive deeper into maybe like a heavy metal detox and mold detoxing and what that looks like. But the goal is like once that stuff is cleared out, and we always look at blood work as well, or some other testing at times to make sure all of that's cleared out. And then we finish up by going into a full, pretty intensive in our practice, like rebuilding the gut, heal and seal the gut, addressing any remaining nutrient deficiencies, and then making sure stomach acid is in a really, really good spot.
Yeah. And this is also something that gets forgotten in many, many protocols. And again, and I know you experience this too, but after doing like all the antibiotics and killing and all the other things that people try, like they just kind of go on with their life, forgetting that they just wiped out everything in their gut that should have been there to protect them from the things that they had. So super important to add these things back in to help protect your body from falling back into where you started.
Yeah, and this gets us into the maintenance and how do you prevent this stuff from coming back? And I mean, I went years and years and years without a flare-up of SIBO. And maybe in another episode, we'll talk about a recent flare that I had that was not technically health related. I was related to some other things going on. But it was an easy fix for me once I figured out the reason why. And like when we think about long-term maintenance, you got to make sure your protections are in place. And this means a well-balanced gut. This means the leaky gut intestinal permeability is healed and sealed. This also means stomach acid is in a really good spot and remains in a really good spot. Nutrition for sure is important, although I would say if you do this right, there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to nutrition, and most people can add in most things. Shannon and I have mentioned that we're both gluten-free and cow's dairy-free, and that's because our bodies just don't respond great to these things. And that it's a personal choice that we choose not to reintroduce those because we know how they make us feel and they don't make us feel great. So we choose not to reincorporate those. And then the final piece would be stress management and nervous system regulation work. And this is so important. And if you're going to have a flare, the chances of it corresponding to a very stressful time or coming right after a very stressful time is huge. And when we're done working with someone in in their protocols and as a client, we make sure we talk about this because this is so important. Because we know, like, look, life happens. Like, stress is gonna happen. You're gonna have stressful periods in your life, and so part of this maintenance protocol is when these things happen, what needs to be done to make sure that we don't end up in the same position that we did in the first place. And so this looks like stomach acid support. Maybe during more stressful periods of time. For me, I'll take some HCl with Pepsin with my meals. It's not all the time, but during more stressful periods of time, for sure, you better believe that thing is always on hand. Uh, Also, extra liver support, because once again, the toxin piece, I have a very clean lifestyle, but I also know if I'm undergoing a lot of stress, I'm going to produce excess cortisol. And just like the daily exposure that we all have to toxins, is my body's going to have a harder time keeping up. So liver support, castor oil packs, Epsom salt baths, rebounding, sauna, like dry brushing, all of these things are really supportive and helpful. And also making sure nutrients stay in a really good spot. We usually recommend staying on a multivitamin most of the time for most people. At times if I'm undergoing like weeks or months of stress where I don't have a ton of control, I'm probably going to go on a prenatal multivitamin or something to give me a little extra boost in some of the nutrients that I'm missing. And then nervous system regulation, stress management becomes even more important. And I may add in like extra sleep support at that time. Honestly, the castor oil packs are kind of do a lot of that for me. Sleep support, stress management, liver support, hormone balancing, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And, same thing. I always keep those things on hand, and I'm fairly, yeah, we recommend that to all clients, talking about stress management and liver support at the end. And those are things that we, like Megan was saying, we do in our lifestyle. Like, we actively do those things to try and stay on top of it. And I also recently had a flare up, so maybe we'll have to talk about that on a different episode and how we kind of went through that and got it back under control. But yeah, the stress management piece, and I want to add this in too, because I think people get overwhelmed when they hear that and think they need to do like an hour meditation or something like that. And that is not the case. Like, you can literally take 2 to 5 minutes to sit down and just like take a couple deep breaths and check in with yourself. Like, notice, how are you feeling? Get your body to slow down. Doing that alone is going to put your brain, your digestion, all these things in line and in a good place, and kind of set you up for a better day, essentially.
Yeah, for sure. And then the last piece of this that we'll usually recommend to clients is doing some sort of full moon protocol 1 to 3 times a year. And this looks like a 1 week kind of protocol. I will say maybe 2 weeks, because it's 1 week of like killing, and then another week of a little bit of like prebiotic kind of support. And basically what this is it's basically just a little extra cleanup during a few times a year. And for me, I usually do it 2 or 3 times a year. I use the products from Cellcore. I'll use Pair 1, Pair 2, Pair 3, and usually biotoxin binder or some sort of binder in support with this. And using all of these products, and we're doing a full sweep over the course of just 1 week when parasites are more active, but it's also going to do a sweep of bacteria, yeast, and fungus in addition to the parasites. And, for me, I do it more often because I have a cute little dog named Ash, and he's a kisser. And I just can't say no to the kisses ever. And it's really tough. And so I know, because I'm kissed on my face by him on a daily basis, my exposure to parasites is on the higher side. And so that's why I do mine 2 or 3 times a year versus someone who maybe doesn't have a pet that licks them on their face. Maybe they do it once or twice a year.
Yeah. Yeah, that's typically what I recommend to clients, is like 1 or 2 times a year, unless you're being exposed, you have high exposure. Yeah, then you might want to think about doing it a little more often.
Yeah, so it's 1 week of that, and then 1 week of a little bit of a probiotic and prebiotic, just to make sure, once again, that gut and all of the balance of bacteria in there stays in a good spot, because it's maintenance. And that keeps us in a really, really good spot long term.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in another episode as well, but you can also, and this is kind of where diet comes into, like, making sure you're getting those prebiotic, like foods in, and even the probiotics, like through fermented foods, kombucha, kimchi, good quality yogurts and whatnot. That stuff is also really good for maintenance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, huge part. So yeah. So that is SIBO. That is our take on SIBO. A lot of information here, but I hope you guys found this helpful. And that once again, like SIBO is something that's pretty near and dear to our hearts because we experienced it for so long without any real support and being able to address it long term until we looked at this bigger picture here and how to learn this the hard way ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And if anything, we just hope that, this reaches people who need to hear it, maybe are in a low spot and looking just for a different direction to go in. Yeah.
Yeah. So we hope you found this helpful. Please make sure to like, subscribe. If it resonates, give us a 5-star review. All of that is super helpful for us, especially as we're just getting started here. And make sure to join us on our next episode. And thanks so much for joining.